About a week ago, after months of investigations and weeks of anticipation, the Mueller Report was submitted to Congress and the American public. The full thing is like a 480-page summary of what the investigation uncovered, the special counsel's recommendations, and his rationale for said recommendations. But let's be real here, 480 pages is a lot, especially when it's penned in a prototypical bureaucratic way, technical, direct, and in plain language. It's not exactly an invigorating read. Most people, understandably, haven't read it. They instead rely on people who they recognize as experts to be able to distill the important things from all of the stuff included in those 480 pages. But the problem is that people doing the distilling are putting that information through frames that have already been long established, and the report is chock full of enough information for both the left and the right to further these pre-decided narratives. On the left, people are saying how the report highlights the president's mendacity, immorality, and corruption, saying that it definitively proves both collusion and obstruction of justice. There's debate as to whether or not they want to proceed with impeachment, but that call is becoming increasingly mainstream. On the right, people are generally following the narrative Attorney General William Barr set out in his original 4-page memo and in the press conference immediately preceding the release of the document. That is, under Mueller's definition, the Trump campaign did not collude with Russia, and that the special counsel did not find sufficient evidence to recommend charges of obstruction of justice. The thing is that both of these frames are incomplete at best and misleading at worst. But instead of trying to go through and trying to address every popular talking point, I thought it'd be better to let people make up their own minds. So today, I want to give you guys as complete a review of the Mueller Report as I can, and after doing that, I want to talk about what its conclusions mean, both in terms of how I interpret it, as well as what it means for the president going forward. Full disclosure on a couple of things first, I have actually read the full 480 pages. I haven't read it 2 or 3 times like some people are claiming, but I have given the full thing a thorough and deliberate read. Honestly, I haven't read anything this long, this closely, since I was studying for my qualifying exams. So while I have actually read it, keep in mind that this video represents one read by one specific person. Second, since biases creep in at all stages of research, I thought I should be open about what my prior beliefs were prior to reading the document. I didn't think that Trump himself conspired with Putin or something like that, but I did believe that members of his campaign and transition team colluded with people tied to the Russian government to get an underhanded upper hand on Hillary Clinton in 2016. I also strongly believe that President Trump attempted to obstruct justice several times throughout the investigation, initially by firing James Comey, but also through a number of other actions that were documented both publicly and through Twitter as well as through popular news presses. So, in short, I thought that Trump was probably guilty of obstruction and members of his campaign were guilty of some sort of federal offense relating to collusion, since collusion itself is not a crime, but I did find myself having some of my beliefs updated as a reading of this investigation, so, take that for what it's worth. The report itself is broken into 2 parts. The first concerns the possibility of the Trump campaign colluding with Russia on its election interference techniques, and the second is about whether or not President Trump himself obstructed justice in the investigation of that first part. I'm going to talk about what both of these volumes say before getting into my opinion about them and everything else. So here's going to be time marks for the video in case you want to jump around to specific parts. I'll generally try to use the report's own words, but I'll also have to do some interpreting since, it's a lot and it ain't that engaging. In either case, I'm going to be putting page numbers in the top left-hand corner for citations. Let's start with Russian interference in the election. The report details 2 kinds of Russian interference in the 2016 election. The first comes from the Internet Research Agency, a Russian entity which conducted online services with the hope of changing international affairs. The Internet Research Agency, or IRA, began work in 2014 with the general hopes of seeding division in the broader US culture. By 2016, however, internal documents revealed that the agency's main priority had shifted to supporting the Trump campaign and opposing the Clinton campaign. The agency still maintained some of its aim of seeding division in the US, but by that point, its main aim was influencing the election. The main way it operated was by pretending to be US-based citizens and organizations. IRA operatives would create accounts on various social media platforms, pretending to be grassroots movements across the ideological spectrum. This included groups like Stop All Immigrants, Blacktivists, LGBT United, and United Muslims of America. As per the report, quote, collectively, the IRA's social media accounts reached tens of millions of US persons. Individual IRA social media accounts attracted hundreds of thousands of followers. These organizations tried to influence attitudes and behaviors in a couple of different ways. First, by getting the attention of real political elites here in the United States who would unwittingly promulgate the group's messages. This included Trump surrogates and official members of the Trump campaign who unknowingly cited or retweeted materials that ultimately originated from the IRA. It also included the president himself. Second, by using real Americans inspired by their message to coordinate actual rallies. These rallies would sometimes get support from campaign volunteers in the forms of signs and other materials who did not know that they were being contacted by foreign nationals. These rallies would also get the attention of people in the campaign, including the president himself. life. Again, it appears that all of this was going on without people actually knowing that these were individuals in Russia. The other form of Russian interference came in the Russian government's hacking of computers and email accounts associated with the Clinton campaign. The intrusions were generally preempted by spear phishing efforts, which trick people into putting their login credentials into a site that looks like the place they're trying to get to, but is actually just collecting that information. The Russians proceeded to steal documents from the DCCC and the DNC, and ultimately forwarded these materials to WikiLeaks. They knew that the documents would be well received there, since Julian Assange has an open disdain towards Hillary Clinton. It took these stolen documents, as well as 30,000 Clinton emails that were obtained through a Freedom of Information request, and published them with the explicit intent of harming the Clinton campaign. In this vein also came attacks from the Russian government into state and county election systems. It also included an attack that came 5 hours after then-candidate Trump said this.
I will tell you this. Russia, if you're listening, I hope you're able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing. I think you will probably be rewarded mightily by our press.
The report noted that this was the first time the Russians attempted to hack this individual site, but did not comment on any motivations behind the timing. To briefly interject my own interpretation here, some are seeing this as evidence of conspiracy between Trump and the Kremlin. I'm more inclined to see this as furthering Russia's general goal of destabilizing the electoral system. That is, they were probably inspired by the president's improper comments and figured that this would add suspicion, which was just, a bonus. Again, my interpretation, not corroborated by the report in either direction. That's as good a time as I need to talk about the charges of collusion. Now, the report mentioned a lot of contacts with Russia. I mean, a lot of contacts between members of the campaign and Russia. As per the report, the office investigated whether those contacts constituted the third avenue of attempted Russian interference with or influence on the 2016 presidential election. In particular, the investigation examined whether these contacts involved or resulted in coordination or conspiracy with the Trump campaign and Russia, including with respect to Russia providing the assistance to the campaign in exchange for any sort of favorable treatment in the future. Based upon the available evidence, the investigation did not establish such coordination. I'm going through all the contacts because, again, it's a lot. I feel that the best thing to do would just talk about the two that, at least from my perspective, are getting the most attention. These are the Trump Tower deals and the stuff dealing with George Papadopoulos. Before going in, it's important to note what the special counsel defined as collusion, since collusion doesn't actually have a legal definition and has frankly become whatever people want it to be. They instead address whether or not members of the campaign coordinated with Russian interference activities, with coordination defined as requiring an agreement, tacit or express, between the Trump campaign and the Russian government on election interference. That requires more than two parties taking actions that were informed by or responsive to the other's actions or interests. For those keeping track at home, a truncated version of the definition was presented in Barr's 4-page summary. Specifically, it left out the second half about the two parties taking actions informed by the others. And that matters because the first half alone would suggest that members of the campaign didn't knowingly try to get material gained from Russia to affect the election. But the report establishes that they absolutely did. They didn't just plan election interference operations with the Russian government ahead of time. Starting with the Trump Tower meeting on June 3rd, 2016, Robert Goldstone, publicist of Amin Aligrov, who himself is a Russian real estate developer with ties to Putin, who worked with Trump in the 2013 Miss Universe pageant and non-potential Trump Moscow projects, reached out to Donald Trump Jr. with the following email. Good morning. Amin just called and asked me to contact you with something very interesting. The Crown Prosecutor of Russia met with his father, Aras, this morning, and in their meeting offered to provide Trump campaign with some official documents and information that would incriminate Hillary and her dealings with Russia and would be very useful to your father. This is obviously very high level and sensitive information, but is part of Russia and its government support for Mr. Trump. Trump Jr. and Amin, through several short phone calls, ultimately arranged a meeting with former Russian prosecutor Natalia Veselnitskaya. I'm probably just butchering that. Jr. and Manafort and Kushner all planned to attend the meeting, but ultimately Manafort did not attend. The report also documents that President Trump was aware that Trump Jr. had arranged this meeting aimed at getting dirt on Clinton, but it was not clear whether or not President Trump was aware that the meeting was linked to Russia specifically. The meeting itself lasted 20 minutes, but the information that Veselnitskaya delivered didn't live up to its promise. She detailed how individuals with business in Russia engaged in financial malfeasance in Russia and then donated that money to the DNC in the United States. Trump Jr. attempted to discern whether or not that could be linked to Hillary Clinton and her campaign. When it became evident that it could not and that Veselnitskaya's real intent was to discuss the Magnitsky Act, Trump Jr. and Kushner became aggravated and found ways to cut the meeting short. The Special Counsel concluded that there was not enough evidence to bring charges forward on Kushner and Trump Jr. for campaign finance violations, which could have potentially been in play since there is a federal ban on materials originating from foreign countries with the intent of influencing U.S. elections. But it's not that there wasn't sufficient evidence that something happened, but that there wasn't enough to satisfy the government's high level of proof that would make it likely for a conviction to be gained. Moving now to George Papadopoulos. Papadopoulos was brought onto the Trump campaign as a foreign policy advisor from March of 2016 through October of that year. He had been seeking work as a policy advisor since the previous year, but the campaign was not hiring at the time. However, when it began getting heat for the lack of foreign policy expertise, he was approached with a job offer that he ultimately accepted. It was around this time that he was approached by Joseph Misfud, a professor of the London Academy of Diplomacy. As Misfud learned that Papadopoulos was to be a senior policy advisor, he offered to help him meet European leaders and individuals of influence, which Papadopoulos readily accepted. After meeting Misfud and a Russian woman named Olga Polanskaya, Papadopoulos started talking to members of the Trump campaign about trying to get a meeting between members of the campaign and members of the Russian government, including possibly Putin, to try to set up the tenor of the administration's foreign policy there. He voiced these opinions to President Trump and other policy advisors during a meeting in late March, and the president was reportedly very responsive. About a month later, Misfud informed Papadopoulos that Russia had quote-unquote dirt in the form of thousands of emails from or relating to Hillary Clinton. Papadopoulos told a diplomat from another country that the Russians had dirt, and that the campaign had received interactions from Russia that said that the nation could help the Trump campaign by anonymously releasing this dirt. This diplomat later told U.S. intelligence about this, and the ensuing FBI investigation became the seed of what would ultimately become the Mueller investigation. However, it doesn't appear that Papadopoulos told anyone in the campaign this information. The report indicated that the investigatory team looked into whether or not he did, but no one could definitively recall whether he had in either direction. Quote, no documentary evidence and nothing in the email accounts or other communication facilities reviewed by the office shows that Papadopoulos shared this information with the campaign. It was determined that there was not enough evidence to suggest that Papadopoulos was acting as an unregistered foreign agent. He did, however, lie to investigators on a couple of counts and pleaded guilty to making those false statements. Both of these cases, and in general, the investigation did not find sufficient evidence that members of the campaign coordinated with Russia, given the extended definition I provided earlier. Asia wants to say hi. Oh. Yeah. We get a short kitty break. Oh, and she's gone. So that's the first volume of the report. The second is on whether or not President Trump attempted to obstruct justice. Unlike collusion, obstruction of justice actually has a legal definition, and it's comprised of 3 parts. First is that an action must be made that somehow impedes an official proceeding, or, with the reasonable belief that it would impede an official proceeding. Second, the action must have a quote-unquote nexus with an official proceeding. That is, it actually has to be connected in some way to some sort of official process involved in the justice system. Third, it had to be motivated by corrupt intent. Generally, corrupt intent is sufficiently proven by the existence of an underlying crime that they were trying to cover up, but that does not always have to be the case. Special counsel investigated 11 different instances or broader moments through an obstruction of justice framework. Here again, I'm going to focus on a subset of those, specifically the president's actions towards former FBI Director James Comey, the president's attempt to fire Special Counsel Robert Mueller, and the president's insistence that former Attorney General Jeff Sessions unrecuse himself and limit the scope of the investigation. Starting first with Comey, the president first met the former FBI Director on January 7, 2017, when the director and other members of the intelligence community disclosed to then-President-elect Trump that Russia had interfered with the election. It soon came out that Michael Flynn had lied about previous contacts with Russian officials and was under investigation. Flynn resigned as a result. While things were getting sorted out about Flynn, the president dined with Comey and over the course of that dinner demanded the director's loyalty. According to Comey's account, at one point during the dinner, the president stated, quote, "I need loyalty. I expect loyalty." Comey did not respond and the conversation moved on to other topics, but the president returned to the subject of Comey's job at the end of the dinner and repeated, quote, "I need loyalty." Comey responded, quote, "You will always get honesty from me." The president later denied asking for loyalty, but the special counsel investigation ultimately found Comey's claims to be more credible. After Flynn resigned, the president resented that the press appeared to be intimating that he himself was under investigation for colluding with Russia. Comey assured the president that he was not personally under investigation. But President Trump wanted that fact to be widely known, but Comey was reluctant to make it appear that the president was interfering with the investigation. The president, though, was not content with that rationale and made the decision to fire Comey. He later retorted that he believed that doing so would effectively end the investigation into Russian collusion. After that, Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein appointed Robert Mueller to be special counsel and investigate if there was collusion in the election and if the president had obstructed justice by firing the FBI director. Which brings us to the ways that the president tried to fire the special counsel. The president was reportedly distraught upon hearing that a special counsel had been appointed. When Sessions told the president that a special counsel had been appointed, the president slumped back in his chair and said, "Oh God, this is terrible. This is the end of my presidency. I'm fucked." Did I have to include that profanity? No. Did I want to so that I could dare YouTube to demonetize me since I'm just quoting the president? Yep, just a little. The president was furious that Sessions recused himself from the investigation and faulted Sessions for failing to protect him. He told Sessions to quit, and Sessions then tried, but the president changed his mind and let him stay on. The president then started alleging that the special counsel had a conflict of interest and could not fairly investigate him. The president cited as conflicts that Mueller had interviewed for the FBI director position shortly before being appointed as special counsel, that he had worked for a firm that represented people affiliated with the president, and that Mueller had disputed certain fees relating to his membership in a Trump golf course in Northern Virginia. The president's advisors all told him that none of that constituted actual conflicts of interest. He, however, was less than convinced of that and asserted his desire for Mueller to be let go. He began directing White House counsel Donald McGahn to tell Rosenstein that, quote, Mueller has to go. The president followed up at least twice with McGahn, the former asking the latter if he had, quote, done it, referring to telling Rosenstein to fire Mueller. McGahn intended to quit over the order but was convinced to stay on. He did not make that decision known to the president but was convinced by other members of the administration. Afterwards, the president did not broach the subject with McGahn again, and McGahn stayed in that position. Finally is the issue of the president's persistent inveighing of then Attorney General Jeff Sessions to unrecuse himself and reduce the scope of the investigation such that it no longer included obstruction of justice charges. And honestly, this is one of the shortest ones in the entire report, as the president had former campaign manager Corey Lewandowski write the draft of a speech that he wanted Sessions to give. I know that I've recused myself from certain things having to do with specific areas, but our POTUS is being treated very unfairly. He shouldn't have a special prosecutor / counsel because he hasn't done anything wrong. I was on the campaign with him for 9 months. There were no Russians involved with him. I know for a fact because I was there. He didn't do anything wrong except he ran the greatest campaign in American history. Our group of people want to subvert the Constitution of the United States. I am going to meet with the special prosecutor to explain this is very unfair and let the special prosecutor move forward with investigating election meddling for future elections so that nothing can happen in future elections. This draft was never delivered, but when it became increasingly clear that Sessions was not going to restrict the scope of the investigation or unrecuse himself, the president looked to fire him. He was eventually talked out of it though. At least for a time. Sessions was ultimately fired by the president after the midterm elections. So those are some of the acts. Unlike the collusion section though, the report does not determine whether or not they could recommend obstruction of justice charges, and they do that for a few reasons. First, current Office of Legal Counsel opinion is that a sitting president cannot be indicted of a crime because it would detract from the president's ability to govern. The opinion says that a president can be investigated, but it's up to Congress to first remove the president from office before the individual inhabiting it can be charged with a crime. This dovetails into a second reason. The fact that a president cannot be tried means that the president would not get the opportunity to dispel false notions in a court of law in front of an impartial judge. They even prevented themselves from making future prosecutorial decisions because doing so would prevent the president from having the procedural protections involved in a true criminal trial. Instead, in all 11 cases, the special counsel noted ways that the action could fit under the three-part definition of obstruction of justice, as well as additional interpretations that could rebuff those original ones. This, by the way, is loosely consistent with Burr's 4-page summary of the report. But what isn't consistent is his general idea that the report casts doubts on the mitigating suggestions it put forward. It was less of a here are the reasons why it could be obstruction of justice and here are the reasons why it couldn't be, so much as it was a here is an analysis of how well it adheres with the tripartite definition, and here are a few mitigating factors with a range of plausibility. For instance, regarding the firing of Comey, the report very clearly laid out how firing Comey could have been intended to be an obstructive act, and then said, well, it is possible that the president didn't anticipate this to be an obstructive act because X, Y, Z reasons, but then doesn't go into how credible he feels that alternative reasoning is, and he does this for all 11 cases. And being honest, the fact that he doesn't say that the alternatives are more credible is actually pretty damning. See, the investigation was sensitive to the potential impacts it could have on the president's ability to govern, and said that it would have explicitly stated if they could conclude that the president didn't obstruct justice, but they couldn't. If we had confidence, after a thorough investigation of the facts, that the president clearly did not commit obstruction of justice, we would so state. Based on the facts and applicable legal standards, however, we are unable to reach that judgment. The evidence we obtained about the president's actions and intent presents difficult issues that prevent us from conclusively determining that no criminal conduct occurred. Accordingly, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him. Now, to be clear, there was 110% things that I did not include in this video, and they're not inconsequential, right? Like stuff about the Trump Tower deal in Moscow, stuff about how the campaign had somebody who was willing to work with foreign intelligence services to get emails that they hacked from the Clintons' personal server, about Trump's threats towards Michael Cohen, about his inveighing of Comey to drop the Flynn investigation, and I didn't include these things because the video is already much longer than a normal video is, and I wanted people to actually, watch it. But I did include a link to a fully searchable PDF version of the report, so you guys can look at that at your own leisure. Alright, so now my opinions on this whole thing. I'm away from this with a slightly different perspective. I believe that members of the campaign did not collude with Russia in the sense that they coordinated with it to hack the emails and get dirt on Clinton, But I do believe, as the evidence clearly demonstrates, that they willfully engage with agents of Russia, a US adversary, to gain the upper hand in an election. And to me, while not criminal, that is grossly immoral. I don't know why it would be controversial to say that those competing in a Democratic campaign should not cooperate with agents whose ultimate goal is the subversion of that democratic system. The fact that people are trying to defend their actions as somehow proper is honestly truly baffling. The problem, though, is that the term collusion is so slippery that people are going to define it however the heck they want in order to say that yes, this was collusion, or no, this wasn't collusion. In reality, the whole linguistic slipperiness is distracting us from the real issue, which is the impropriety of the actions. But honestly, I think the frames are too calcified to be able to fully address this question, which is a real shame because that really seems to be the thing that we should be addressing here instead of just, arguing stuff that serves to only mobilize the base. I think, though, that if a case had to be made for one individual in the campaign coordinating with Russia, it would be George Papadopoulos, the Trump foreign policy advisor. If we look at the timeline, Papadopoulos was told that the Russians, quote, have dirt on Clinton just around the time that Russia began hacking the DNC and DCCC computers, which could mean that the professor had some inside baseball knowledge going on with it. Papadopoulos would be saved by the fact that he didn't actively encourage Russian hacking, but merely sought to gain from the fruits of their illicit efforts. He ain't innocent, none of them are, but they're not legally guilty. I do find it interesting that Mueller decided to not recommend charges for Kushner and Trump Jr., though. From what I can gather, the biggest reason was that there wasn't evidence that the two didn't know that the transfer of dirt would constitute a campaign finance violation, which to me is pretty weak sauce. I'm obviously not a lawyer, but I've been taught by just about everyone who I've ever met that was involved with law that ignorance of a crime is not a viable defense. Maybe it's different on the federal level, or maybe Kushner and Trump Jr. are buffered by the extra step that the FBI want to be able to take to make sure that they can actually get a conviction, but I don't know. Again, that just seemed a little off to me personally, again, in my non-lawyerly opinion. Regarding obstruction of justice, I don't know why people are coming away from this report claiming that it somehow exonerates or vindicates the president. It very clearly and very absolutely does not. I'm actually more convinced than when I started reading that the president attempted to obstruct justice, if not in law, at least in spirit. Right, establishing criminal intent may be technically difficult because there wasn't really a crime to cover up, but the report definitely shows that the president was trying to obstruct the investigation for purposes of his own vanity, at the very least. It may not have been criminal intent guiding his actions, but it was certainly corrupt intent. The president is used to clamping down on threats to his brand with an iron fist, a pattern that he's extended into his presidency. He may not have been interfering because he thought he'd go to jail, but he was interfering because he wanted to limit the damage to his reputation. But that is profoundly undemocratic, even if it doesn't violate laws. Or at least it can't be determined right now because of special circumstances if it violates laws, but at the very least, it violates norms, which norms are really the thing that is stitching this system of government together. Not laws per se, but the actions that people do when laws don't explicitly spell something out. Some people have said that the report contains enough information to initiate impeachment proceedings, which, honestly, yeah, I would say it does. Although I don't really think it's alone in that, since impeachment is a political process and not a legal process per se. The president's numerous actions and controversies outside of the Mueller report are arguably enough to initiate impeachment proceedings if enough people in Congress were sympathetic to that argument. That's not to say that the report isn't damaging. It is, the last half of it especially, and it's impossible to come away claiming otherwise without looking like a partisan hack. This is 200 pages of carefully investigated, meticulously documented, and highly credible arguments suggesting that the president cannot be legally exonerated of obstruction of justice. And it also happens to include with a lecture on the checks and balances system, which, seems like a pretty transparent nod to Congress. I don't want to get into whether or not President Trump should be impeached, mostly because the word should is surprisingly loaded, and that answer depends just as much on whether you're talking about good electoral strategy or good democratic practice as you are if you're talking whether or not you're a Democrat or Republican. And this video is already long enough as it is. I'm honestly surprised that my voice is still holding out. I hope that watching this video you get a sense of what's inside the report and come away with your own opinions. I have mine, obviously, but I ultimately think it's important that people be given the ability to come up with their own perceptions based upon information with, at least as little bias and framing as I can muster. But with that, what do you guys think about the Mueller report? Are you surprised by what it says? Not surprised? What do you think should happen from here? Let me know down in the comment section below, as well as the thoughts you had while watching this video or suggestions for future topics. I'm always happy to have those down there as well. I'm looking forward to reading all of them and answering a few in the next office hours. Special thanks to those supporting Professor Politics on Patreon. I'd like to give a special shout out to research assistant Sam Deely. Patrons get early content, exclusive content, and shout outs. So if you'd like to help out, you can click the link down in the doobly-doo or embed it at the end card of the video. I really appreciate it. Last time I had this awesome collaboration with Mr. Beat that I really enjoyed about term limits, and while I'd love to make a comment response section of the video, it's already very long at this point. So we're going to pick up the comments to that video in the next one. You know, a video that isn't, you know, basically a freaking marathon. With that, that'll do it for this video. Thank you guys in advance for your comments. I'm really looking forward to reading them. Sources for everything is always down in the doobie-doo, as well as links to Facebook, Twitter, and the blog. Look forward to seeing you guys out there as well. If you enjoyed this video, hope you consider giving it a thumbs up. If you want to support the channel, you can do so by commenting down below, by sharing this video, and by subscribing to the channel so you're in the loop for more awesome source science content is uploaded. If you want to be guaranteed to be in the loop when I upload a new video, be sure to click the bell icon as well. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you next time.